Her name was Miriam. She was 36 years old, which in the hills of Galilee in the year we now call 30 AD, made her a woman who had already outlived many of her neighbors, many of her childhood friends, and both of her parents. She lived alone in a small stone house on the eastern edge of Kafar Nahum, the village that Roman maps would later call Capernaum, perched on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where the water was deep and blue, and the air smelled of fish and wild thyme, and the faint mineral tang of the hot springs that bubbled up from the earth a few miles to the south. Her house had 2 rooms, one for sleeping and one for everything else, and the everything else was considerable, because Miriam was a healer, and her second room was her workshop, her pharmacy, her consultation chamber, and her entire world. The walls of that room were lined with shelves that Miriam had built herself from cedar planks purchased at the market in Magdala. On those shelves stood dozens of clay jars, each one sealed with beeswax and marked with a symbol that Miriam had invented, a personal code that only she could read, identifying the contents and the date of preparation. There were jars of dried hyssop, its gray-green leaves still fragrant months after harvest. Jars of myrrh resin, dark and glossy, purchased at great expense from Nabatean traders who brought it north along the incense road from the distant deserts of Arabia. Jars of frankincense, golden and translucent, each piece like a frozen tear of sunlight. Bundles of dried thyme hung from the ceiling beams, alongside rosemary, sage, and rue. On a low stone table near the window sat Miriam's mortar and pestle, carved from basalt, heavy and smooth, worn to a perfect concavity by years of daily use. Beside it were small clay bowls containing olive oil, honey, wine vinegar, and rendered animal fat, the carriers and bases into which Miriam blended her plant medicines to create the salves, poultices, tinctures, and infusions that the people of Kafar Nahum and the surrounding villages depended on for their health and, often enough, their survival. Miriam had learned the healing arts from her mother, a woman named Hannah, who had learned them from her mother before her, who had learned them from hers, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back, as far as Miriam knew, to the time of the Maccabees, and perhaps further still. Hannah had been a formidable woman, tall and strong-boned, with large, capable hands, and a gaze that could make a grown man sit still and stop complaining about the taste of a bitter remedy. She had begun teaching Miriam when the girl was barely 7 years old, taking her into the hills above the village at dawn to gather herbs, teaching her to identify each plant by its leaves, its scent, its flower, its root. She taught Miriam which plants to harvest in spring, which in summer, which in autumn. She taught her how to dry them, how to store them, how to grind them, how to combine them. She taught her the precise ratio of myrrh to honey to thyme that made a wound-healing poultice. She taught her how much hyssop to steep in hot water to ease a congested chest, and how much wormwood to add to wine to rid a child of intestinal parasites without making the child sicker than the parasites had. She taught her that the difference between a remedy and a poison was often nothing more than quantity, and that a healer who did not understand this distinction had no business touching a patient. Hannah had also taught Miriam something less tangible but equally important. She had taught her that healing was not merely a transaction, not simply the application of the right plant to the right ailment. It was a relationship. The healer had to know the patient, their temperament, their fears, their living conditions, their family, their diet, their habits. The same cough in 2 different people might require 2 different treatments because the cough was only a symptom, and the cause, the imbalance, the underlying disturbance could be entirely different. A healer who treated symptoms without understanding causes was like a fisherman who mended his net without noticing the hole. Hannah had died when Miriam was 22, carried off by a fever that came on suddenly during a wet, cold winter and burned through her body in 3 days despite everything Miriam tried. It was the first great failure of Miriam's life, and it marked her deeply. She had stood at her mother's grave in the rocky hillside cemetery outside the village and felt the full, crushing weight of her own limitations. She knew so much. Her mother had given her so much, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. There would always be illnesses she could not cure, wounds she could not close, fevers she could not break. And the dead would always outnumber the saved. But Miriam did not stop. She could not stop. Because every morning someone knocked on her door, a mother with a sick child, a fisherman with an infected hand, an old woman whose joints ached so badly she could not grind her own grain, a young man with a cough that would not clear, a pregnant woman frightened by pains that had come too early. They came because Miriam was the only healer for miles, and because she was good at what she did, and because her remedies worked, not always, not perfectly, but often enough that the people of Kafar Nahum trusted her with their bodies and their lives. On this particular morning, A morning in late spring when the wildflowers were blooming on the hillsides and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of blossoming almond trees, Miriam was grinding a fresh batch of myrrh resin in her basalt mortar when she heard a knock at her door. She wiped her hands on her linen apron and opened it to find a man she had never seen before. He was tall, lean, perhaps 40 years old, with a weathered face, deep-set dark eyes, and the calloused hands of someone who worked with them every day. He wore the simple tunic and cloak of a common laborer, but there was something about his bearing, an alertness, a contained energy, that suggested he was more than he appeared. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, and when he spoke, his Aramaic had the faint accent of someone from the south, from Judea, or perhaps even further, from the desert regions beyond the Jordan. His name, he said, was Nathan. He was a traveling merchant, a trader in resins and spices, and he had come to Kfar Nahum because he had heard, through the network of traders and travelers that connected every village and town in the region, that there was a healer here who used large quantities of myrrh and frankincense in her preparations. He said he could supply her with the finest quality resins, harvested from trees in southern Arabia and transported along the incense road by his own caravan. He said his prices were fair and his product was pure, unlike the adulterated resins sold by many traders in the larger markets, where myrrh was often mixed with cheaper gums and frankincense was diluted with pine resin to increase the seller's profit. Miriam regarded him with the careful, assessing gaze that her mother had taught her to turn on anyone who came to her door with a claim. She had been cheated before by traders selling inferior goods, and she had learned to test every batch of resin she purchased by its color, its texture, its scent when heated, and its behavior when dissolved in oil. She invited Nathan inside and asked him to show her what he had. Nathan opened his leather satchel and produced several small linen pouches, each tied with a different colored cord. He laid them on Miriam's work table and opened them one by one. The first contained myrrh resin, dark reddish-brown, in irregular pieces that caught the light from the window. Miriam picked up a piece, held it to her nose, and inhaled. The scent was rich, complex, slightly bitter, with an undertone of warmth that told her immediately this was genuine Camophora resin, not adulterated. She placed a small piece on a heated stone near her oil lamp and watched as it softened and released a thin curl of fragrant smoke. The smell filled the room, deep and ancient and unmistakable. She nodded. The second pouch contained frankincense, pale golden tears of boswellia resin, each one translucent and slightly sticky to the touch. Miriam tested it the same way, heating a piece and inhaling the smoke. It was clean, pure, with the characteristic bright, almost citrus-like top note that distinguished genuine frankincense from the cheaper substitutes. She nodded again. The third pouch contained something unexpected. It was a resin Miriam did not immediately recognize, darker than frankincense but lighter than myrrh, with a warm, spicy scent that reminded her of cinnamon, but was somehow different, more complex, more layered. Nathan told her it was called Balm of Gilead, harvested from a rare species of tree that grew in only a few locations in the Jordan Valley and was prized throughout the known world for its extraordinary healing properties. He said that Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, barely a generation ago, had valued this substance so highly that she had persuaded the Roman general Mark Antony to gift her the groves where it grew. He said that a single jar of genuine balm of Gilead was worth more than its weight in silver. Miriam had heard of the balm of Gilead. Her mother had spoken of it with a reverence that bordered on awe. Hannah had told Miriam that in the old days, before the Romans, before even the Greeks, the balm had been one of the most sacred healing substances in all of Israel, used by the priests in the temple and by the royal physicians who served the kings. But the groves had changed hands many times over the centuries, and access to the genuine product had become increasingly restricted and expensive. Miriam had never been able to afford it. She had never even seen it. She picked up a piece of the resin and held it between her fingers. It was warm, almost alive, as if it still carried the heat of the desert sun that had coaxed it from the bark of its parent tree. She held it to her nose and closed her eyes, and for a moment, standing in her small stone house on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, she felt a connection, a thread, stretching back through the centuries to every healer who had ever held this substance in their hands and marveled at its power. She opened her eyes and looked at Nathan. "How much?" she asked. Nathan named a price that made Miriam's breath catch. It was more than she earned in 3 months of healing. She told him she could not afford it. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. He said, "I did not come here to sell you the balm of Gilead, Miriam of Kfar Nahum. I came here because I have a problem that silver cannot solve. I came here because I need a healer, and the traders on the road told me you are the best healer between Tiberias and Damascus. He pulled back the sleeve of his tunic, and Miriam saw why he had come. His right forearm bore a wound, long and deep, that had been poorly tended and was now showing unmistakable signs of serious infection. The skin around the wound was swollen, hot, and discolored. The wound itself was weeping a thick, foul-smelling discharge. Miriam could see, with the trained eye that decades of practice had given her, that the infection was not superficial. It had penetrated deep into the tissue, and if it was not stopped, it would spread to the rest of his body. In the world Miriam lived in, a world without modern interventions, this kind of infection was a death sentence more often than not. She looked at Nathan's face and saw the fear he was trying to hide. She had seen that look 1,000 times. The look of a person who knows that something is very wrong and who has come to the last door they know to knock on. She told him to sit down. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every single week we uncover forgotten stories from the ancient world that will change the way you see the one we live in today. Subscribe now, because what happens next in this story is something you will not want to miss. Miriam worked quickly, but carefully. She washed her hands in a basin of water mixed with wine vinegar, a practice her mother had insisted on before touching any patient. Hannah had never explained the reason in terms that a modern person would recognize as microbiology, but she had observed over decades of practice that healers who washed their hands in vinegar before treating wounds had better outcomes than those who did not. It was one of 1,000 small empirical discoveries that had been woven into the tradition, observations made by countless anonymous healers across centuries, refined and transmitted and refined again. A body of practical knowledge as real and as hard-won as anything that would later emerge from the formal institutions of Western medicine. She examined Nathan's wound under the bright light from the window. It was worse than she had initially thought. The original injury, he told her, had been inflicted 3 weeks earlier by a bandit's blade on the road south of the Sea of Galilee. A traveling companion had cleaned the wound with water and wrapped it in cloth, but the cloth had not been clean, and the treatment had been inadequate. Within a week, the wound had begun to swell. Nathan had tried to treat it himself with applications of olive oil, which was a common folk remedy, but oil alone, while useful as a protective barrier on a clean wound, was not sufficient to fight an established infection. The inflammation had deepened and spread. Miriam told Nathan what she intended to do, speaking in the calm, clear voice that she used with all her patients. She would first clean the wound thoroughly. Then she would apply a poultice designed to draw out the infection and promote healing. She would need to change the poultice daily for at least a week, possibly longer. The treatment would be uncomfortable, but not unbearable. And she needed him to stay in the village until the wound was fully healed, because if he left too early and the infection returned on the road, far from any healer, he would not survive. Nathan agreed without argument. Whatever he was not a fool. Miriam began by cleaning the wound with a preparation she made fresh for every patient, a mixture of wine, which contained enough natural alcohol to serve as a disinfectant, and a strong infusion of hyssop, whose antiseptic properties her mother had taught her to value above almost any other herb. She heated the wine gently over her oil lamp to increase its penetrating power, then added the hyssop infusion and used clean linen cloths, boiled in water and dried in the sun, to carefully irrigate and debride the wound, removing the dead and infected tissue with a precision that would have impressed a modern surgeon. Nathan gripped the edge of the stone bench and did not make a sound, though Miriam could see the muscles in his jaw tighten and the sweat break out on his forehead. She had seen soldiers and laborers and fishermen, men who prided themselves on their toughness, weep openly during wound cleaning. Nathan's silence told her something about his character and his life. When the wound was clean, Miriam prepared the poultice. She worked from memory, her hands moving with the confident, automatic grace of long practice. Into her basalt mortar she placed a measured amount of myrrh resin, which she ground to a fine powder. To this she added dried thyme leaves, ground separately to release their essential oils. Then she combined the ground herbs with a generous portion of raw honey, local honey from a beekeeper in the village, thick and golden and fragrant with the nectar of wildflowers. She mixed the preparation until it formed a smooth, thick paste, adjusting the consistency with small additions of olive oil until it reached the texture she wanted, thick enough to stay in place on the wound, but soft enough to make full contact with every surface of the injured tissue. She told Nathan what each ingredient did, not in the language of modern pharmacology, but in the language of her tradition. The myrrh, she said, fights the corruption. It is the strongest warrior among the plants. It goes into the wound and destroys whatever is causing the sickness. The thyme helps the myrrh. They are allies, like two soldiers fighting side by side, each one making the other stronger. The honey feeds the healthy flesh and starves the corruption. It seals the wound against the foul airs that bring new sickness. And the olive oil carries all of these into the deepest part of the wound, where they can do their work. She applied the poultice directly to the cleaned wound, covering every surface with a thick, even layer of the paste. Then she covered the poultice with a piece of clean linen and bound it in place with strips of cloth. She told Nathan to rest, to eat well, to drink clean water, and to return to her house at the same time the following day. Nathan looked at his bandaged arm, then at Miriam. He said, "You speak about the plants as if they are people, as if they have intentions." Miriam considered this. Then she said, "My mother taught me that every plant has a purpose, not a human purpose, not a thought or a will the way you and I have, but a role in the world, a function, a thing it does that nothing else does in quite the same way. The myrrh tree bleeds its resin to protect itself from the insects and diseases of the desert. But that same resin, when we use it wisely, protects us too. My mother said that this is not an accident. She said the world was made so that everything in it can help everything else if we pay attention." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." Miriam looked down at her mortar and pestle, the same mortar and pestle Hannah had used for 30 years before her. She said, "My mother was the wisest person I have ever known, and not a day passes that I do not wish I had listened to her more carefully." Nathan returned the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 2 weeks. Miriam cleaned and redressed the wound each time, preparing fresh poultices and monitoring the healing process with the attentive eye of a woman who had treated hundreds of similar injuries. The improvement was dramatic. Within 3 days, the swelling had visibly decreased. The discharge changed from thick and foul to thin and clear. The discoloration receded. New, healthy tissue began to form at the edges of the wound, pink and firm, gradually filling the space that the infection had carved. By the end of the 2nd week, the wound was closed, the skin was healing cleanly, and Nathan could move his arm without pain for the first time in nearly a month. During those 2 weeks, an unexpected thing happened. Miriam and Nathan began to talk. Not just about the wound, not just about the healing. They talked about their lives, their pasts, the roads they had traveled, and the choices that had brought them to this small stone house on the shore of the inland sea. Nathan told Miriam about his work as a trader, about the long and dangerous caravans that carried resins and spices from the ports of southern Arabia through the desert to the markets of the Mediterranean world. He described landscapes Miriam had never seen and would never see: the vast red desert of the Nabatean kingdom, the terraced frankincense groves of Oman, the bustling harbor of Gaza, where goods from 3 continents converged. He told her about the men he traveled with, the hardships they endured, the bandits and storms and droughts that made every journey a gamble with death. And Miriam, in turn, told Nathan about her work, about the patients she treated, the remedies she prepared, the constant challenge of working without sufficient supplies, without assistance, without the luxury of certainty. She told him about her mother and the chain of knowledge that connected them to generations of healers stretching back into the deep past. She told him about the plants she used and the properties she had observed in them, the same properties that a modern scientist would recognize and validate 2,000 years later. She told him about her successes and her failures, about the people she had saved and the people she had lost, about the weight of responsibility that came with being the only person standing between a community and the indifferent cruelty of disease. Nathan listened with an attention that Miriam found disarming. Most people, she had learned, did not really want to know about healing. They wanted to be healed. They wanted the remedy, the relief, the solution. But they did not want to understand the system behind it, the years of accumulated knowledge, the painstaking observation, the careful balancing of ingredients and dosages. Nathan was different. He asked questions, real questions. Not the skeptical, dismissive questions of someone who doubted her abilities, but the genuine, searching questions of someone who wanted to understand how the world worked, and who recognized that Miriam's knowledge was a window into a dimension of reality that most people never thought about. One evening, as the sun was setting over the lake and the fishermen were hauling in their boats on the pebbly shore below the village, Nathan asked Miriam a question that no one had ever asked her before. He asked her where she thought the knowledge came from. Not the specific recipes, not the individual remedies, but the fundamental insight, the original intuition that plants could heal. How had the first healer, whoever she or he was, thousands of years ago, looked at a plant growing in the wild and thought, This can help a person who is sick. Miriam thought about this for a long time. The light was fading, turning the stone walls of her house a warm golden amber. The scent of dried herbs hung in the air, as familiar to her as her own breath. She said, "I think it began with watching animals. My mother told me that the first healers learned by observing what the wild creatures did when they were sick or injured. A wounded deer will seek out certain plants and chew them. A sick bird will eat clay from a riverbank. A dog with a stomach ailment will eat grass. The animals do not reason about it. They do not have formulas or traditions, but they know in their bodies what will help them. And the first humans who watched this really watched it with patience and attention. They began to try the same plants themselves. And some of them worked. And the ones that worked were remembered and passed on. And over time, over many generations, the knowledge grew, became more refined, more precise, more powerful, until it became what I do today, what my mother did, what her mother did. It is not magic. It is not a gift from the heavens. It is the accumulated observation of 1,000 lifetimes." Nathan looked at her in the fading light, and something shifted in his expression, a softening, a deepening, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. He said, "You carry something precious, Miriam. You know that, do you not?" Miriam said, "I know. That is why I cannot stop, even when I want to. Even when I lose someone and the grief is so heavy I cannot breathe. I cannot stop because if I stop, the chain breaks. And then all those lifetimes of watching and learning and remembering are gone." She paused. "And they cannot be relearned," she said quietly. "Not in a single lifetime. Not in 10 lifetimes. Once this kind of knowledge is lost, it is lost forever." Nathan did not respond, but he reached into his leather satchel and took out the small pouch of balm of Gilead resin. He placed it on the table between them. "Consider it payment for saving my arm," he said. And then, more quietly, "for saving more than my arm." Miriam looked at the pouch, then at Nathan. She began to protest, to say that the balm was too valuable, that she could not accept such a gift. But Nathan raised a hand and said, "It is not a gift, it is an investment. You will use it to heal people who need healing, and the value of that is greater than anything I could sell it for in any market in the world." Miriam took the pouch. She opened it and held a piece of the resin in her palm. It was warm and fragrant, and in that moment, in the last light of the setting sun, she felt the weight of it, not its physical weight, but the weight of its history, the weight of every hand that had harvested it, transported it, traded it, used it, across centuries and across continents, an unbroken chain of human effort and knowledge linking the desert groves of the Jordan Valley to her small stone house on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. She closed her fingers around it and held it against her heart. Nathan's wound healed completely, but he did not leave Kfar Nahum. He told Miriam he needed to rest before continuing his journey south, and this was partly true. But the fuller truth, which they both understood without speaking it, was that something had taken root between them during those 2 weeks of conversation and proximity, something neither of them had expected, and neither of them quite knew how to name. It was not the sudden, consuming passion of youth. Both of them were past the age for that. It was something quieter and in many ways stronger, a recognition, a kinship, the sense of having found in another person a rare and unexpected companion for the difficult road of being alive. Nathan rented a small room from a fisherman's family near the shore and spent his days helping with the fishing boats, repairing nets, and making himself useful in the small ways that a capable, experienced man could in a village that survived on communal labor and mutual dependence. In the evenings, he walked to Miriam's house, and they sat together in her herb garden, which occupied a small walled courtyard behind the house, talking until the stars came out over the lake. But the tranquility of those weeks was deceptive. Beyond the quiet hills of Galilee, forces were in motion that would soon reach Kfar Nahum and disrupt everything. The first sign of trouble came on a hot afternoon in early summer, when a Roman patrol arrived in the village. This was not unusual in itself. Kfar Nahum was located near a major trade route, and Roman soldiers passed through regularly, sometimes stopping to requisition food or lodging, sometimes merely marching through on their way to somewhere else. The villagers had learned to endure these visits with the wary, practiced submission of people who had lived under occupation for generations. They knew the rules. They knew the risks. They knew that resistance, however justified, was likely to bring consequences far worse than compliance. But this patrol was different. It was led by a centurion named Gaius Flavius Marcellus, a man whose reputation preceded him through the region like a cold wind. Gaius was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with a scarred face and flat, gray eyes that seemed to register everything and care about nothing. He had served in the legions for over 25 years, posted to Judea for the last 8, and he had developed during that time a profound and comprehensive contempt for the local population, their customs, their religion, and their constant simmering resentment of Roman authority. He was not a deliberately cruel man, but he was an indifferent one, which in a position of power amounted to much the same thing. Gaius had a specific reason for coming to Kafar Nahum. Several of his soldiers had fallen ill with a persistent digestive ailment, likely caused by contaminated water at their garrison near Tiberias. The garrison's own physician, a Greek named Demetrios, who practiced a more formal, Hippocratic style of medicine, had been unable to resolve the problem. Gaius had heard from local informants that there was a healer in Kafar Nahum who was renowned for treating exactly this kind of illness. He had come, not out of respect for local medicine, but out of the pragmatic desperation of a military commander whose fighting force was being diminished by a problem his own physician could not solve. Gaius arrived at Miriam's door with 2 soldiers flanking him and the sick men waiting outside. He did not knock. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his armored bulk filling the small room, his eyes scanning the shelves of clay jars, the hanging herbs, the mortar and pestle, the work table, with the appraising, dismissive gaze of a man who was accustomed to taking what he wanted and saw no reason to change the habit. Miriam was inside, preparing a tincture for an elderly woman in the village who suffered from joint pain. She looked up at the centurion and felt the instinctive flash of fear that every person under Roman occupation felt when confronted by armed authority. But she had learned from her mother, and from her own years of practice, to master her fear in the presence of patients and soldiers alike. A healer who showed fear lost the confidence of those who depended on her, and Miriam depended on that confidence for everything. Gaius told her bluntly what he needed. His soldiers were sick. His physician had failed. She would treat them. This was not a request. Miriam asked what their symptoms were. Gaius described them: severe cramping, frequent loose bowels, weakness, loss of appetite, a condition that had persisted for over 2 weeks and was growing worse. Miriam recognized the pattern immediately. It was a common ailment in the region, particularly during the hot months when water sources became stagnant and contaminated. She had treated it dozens of times. She told Gaius that she would need to examine the soldiers and prepare a treatment that would take several days to work. She would need to be paid for the herbs and the time, and she would need the soldiers to follow her instructions precisely, particularly regarding what they ate and drank during the treatment period. Gaius looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he dropped a small pouch of Roman silver coins on her work table, more money than Miriam typically earned in 2 months, and said, "If they are not better in 5 days, I will hold you responsible." The threat was unmistakable. But Miriam took the coins, examined the soldiers, and set to work. The treatment she prepared was a classic of the Galilean healing tradition, one that her mother had used many times, and that drew on several of the core plants in the healer's repertoire. She began with a strong infusion of cumin seeds, which had been used throughout the Near East for centuries to soothe digestive distress and restore normal bowel function. Modern pharmacology would later identify the volatile compounds in cumin, particularly cuminaldehyde and thymol, as having carminative, antispasmodic, and mild antimicrobial properties, precisely the effects that Miriam observed in her patients. To the cumin infusion, she added coriander seeds, another traditional digestive remedy, and a small amount of ginger root, which she obtained from the same trade networks that supplied her with resins and spices. Ginger, known throughout the ancient world as a warming and strengthening herb, was particularly effective at calming nausea and restoring appetite, symptoms that the sick soldiers were experiencing. But the centerpiece of Miriam's treatment was something more specific and more potent. She prepared a concentrated decoction of wormwood, the bitter, silver-leaved herb that grew wild on the hillsides around the village. Wormwood was the traditional weapon against intestinal parasites and the infections they caused, and Miriam suspected, based on the soldiers' symptoms and the known contamination of water sources near the Tiberias garrison, that parasites were at least partly responsible for their illness. She dosed the wormwood carefully, mindful of her mother's warning that too much could cause its own problems. She dissolved the wormwood decoction in wine, which both masked the extreme bitterness and provided additional mild antiseptic properties. She instructed each soldier to drink a measured cup of the preparation 3 times a day, at morning, midday, and evening, and to eat only plain bread, cooked lentils, and clear broth until she told them otherwise. She specifically prohibited them from drinking any water that had not been mixed with wine or vinegar, a practice that was, she explained to Gaius, essential for preventing the recontamination that would make the treatment useless. Gaius listened to these instructions with visible skepticism. He was a Roman soldier, trained in a tradition that regarded the medical practices of subject peoples as primitive superstition. But he was also a practical man, and his soldiers were getting worse, and his Greek physician had already failed, so he ordered his men to comply. If you are watching this right now and you can feel the tension, if you are wondering what happens next, then do something for me. Leave a comment with these words. I trust the earth. Let us see how many of us carry this ancient faith within us. Within 3 days, the soldiers' condition had improved noticeably. The cramping had diminished. The digestive symptoms were subsiding. Their appetites were returning. By the 5th day, all of them were able to stand, walk, and eat normal food without distress. Gaius inspected them with the critical eye of a commander assessing his resources, and what he saw clearly surprised him. The soldiers were recovering. The village healer's foul-tasting remedy was doing what his trained Greek physician had not been able to do. Gaius did not thank Miriam. He was not a man who thanked people, particularly not provincial healers from a conquered population. But he did something that was, in its own way, more significant. He told her that he would not forget the service she had rendered, and that if she ever needed the protection of Rome, she could send word to the garrison at Tiberias. Miriam did not know it then, but that offhand promise would later save her life. The healing of the Roman soldiers had an immediate and complicated effect on Miriam's standing in the village and the surrounding region. Word spread rapidly, as word always did in the tight-knit communities of Galilee, that the healer of Kafar Nahum had cured Roman soldiers when even their own physician had failed. For many of the villagers, this was a source of quiet pride, proof that their own traditions were superior to the medicine of the occupiers. But for others, it was cause for suspicion and resentment. Miriam had helped the Romans. She had accepted their silver. She had used her skills that were the heritage of her people, to strengthen the health and fighting capacity of the very soldiers who enforced the occupation. Some whispered that she was a collaborator. Others said she had had no choice, and that any healer who refused a Roman centurion's demand would have been punished, perhaps fatally. Miriam was aware of the whispers, and they troubled her. She had not wanted to help the Romans. She had not sought their custom. But when Gaius stood in her doorway and demanded treatment for his men, what choice did she truly have? A healer heals. That was what her mother had taught her. You do not choose your patients based on whether you approve of them. You heal because they are suffering, and you have the knowledge to ease that suffering. The plants do not care who is sick. The remedies do not ask what flag the patient salutes. A wound is a wound. An infection is an infection. Pain is pain. The moment a healer begins to choose who deserves healing and who does not, she ceases to be a healer and becomes something else, something smaller and less worthy of the knowledge she carries. But this principle, noble as it was, did not protect Miriam from the consequences of her visibility. Her success with the soldiers had drawn attention to her, not just locally but regionally, and attention, in the volatile, dangerous world of Roman-occupied Judea, was a commodity best avoided. The trouble took the form of a man named Ezra ben Shimon, a Pharisee from the nearby town of Chorazin, who served as an informal religious authority for several villages in the area. Ezra was a man of considerable learning and rigid conviction, deeply versed in the Torah and the oral traditions, and deeply suspicious of anything that strayed too close to the boundary between permitted healing and forbidden practices. The line was important in Jewish religious law. Healing through prayer, through the application of natural remedies, through the knowledge of plants and their properties, was permissible and even praiseworthy. But healing through incantation, through invocation of spirits or foreign deities, through any practice that smacked of the pagan sorcery common in the surrounding Gentile cultures, was strictly forbidden. Miriam had always been scrupulously careful to stay on the right side of this line. She did not recite incantations over her remedies. She did not invoke spirits or make claims of supernatural power. She healed through plants, knowledge, observation, and skill, the same methods her mother and grandmother had used. But Ezra, who had never liked the idea of a woman operating as an independent healer without the oversight of a male authority, saw an opportunity in the growing attention surrounding Miriam. He began to ask questions in the village. He inquired about the specific remedies Miriam used, particularly the more exotic ones like myrrh and frankincense, which were also used in pagan rituals throughout the Roman world. He questioned whether her claimed knowledge of plants was truly derived from legitimate tradition or whether it concealed darker practices that she kept hidden from the community. The questions were insidious, because they were unanswerable. How could Miriam prove that her remedies were not sorcery? She could show people her plants, explain her preparations, describe the reasoning behind her treatments. But in a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not sharply drawn, where illness itself was often understood as having spiritual dimensions, the mere suggestion that a healer might be practicing forbidden arts was enough to plant seeds of doubt that no amount of evidence could fully eradicate. Nathan, who had remained in the village and had become a familiar and increasingly valued presence in Miriam's daily life, watched these developments with growing alarm. He was a man of the world, a traveler who had seen the internal politics of dozens of communities across the region, and he recognized the pattern immediately. Ezra was not motivated by genuine religious concern. He was motivated by power, by the desire to control what happened in his domain, and by the ancient, persistent discomfort that certain men felt when confronted by a woman who possessed authority and expertise that they could not match. Nathan went to Miriam one evening and told her that he thought she was in danger. He said that Ezra's campaign of insinuation, if unchecked, could escalate into a formal accusation, and that a formal accusation of forbidden practices, even if ultimately disproven, could lead to her expulsion from the community, the destruction of her workshop, and the loss of everything she had built. Miriam listened to Nathan's warning in silence. She was not surprised. She had felt the shift in the village atmosphere, the slight cooling of certain neighbors' greetings, the averted gazes, the way some mothers now hesitated before bringing their sick children to her door, a hesitation that had not existed a month earlier. She said, "I know what Ezra is doing, and I know why, but I will not stop healing because a man who has never held a sick child in his arms decides that my plants frighten him." Nathan said, "I am not asking you to stop. I am asking you to be careful, and I am asking you to let me help." Miriam looked at him. She had spent most of her adult life relying on no one but herself. Her mother had died, and there had been no one to take her place. The villagers depended on Miriam, but dependency was not the same as partnership. Nathan was offering something she had not had since Hannah was alive, a companion, an ally, someone who would stand beside her not because they needed something from her, but because they chose to. She said, "What kind of help?" Nathan said he would use his connections, his network of traders and travelers, to gather testimony from other communities where Miriam's remedies had been used successfully. He would find people who could vouch for the legitimacy of her methods, people whose word carried weight. He would also reach out to other healers in the region, men and women who practiced the same tradition, and ask them to support Miriam if Ezra's campaign escalated into a formal proceeding. And he would do one more thing. He would go to Gaius Flavius Marcellus at the Tiberias garrison and remind the centurion of his promise. Not to ask Rome to intervene in a Jewish religious dispute, which would have been both inappropriate and counterproductive, but to ensure that if Miriam's physical safety were threatened, there would be a power capable of protecting her. Miriam did not like the idea of relying on Roman protection. It would confirm every accusation of collaboration that her detractors were already making. But she also recognized that Nathan was right. In the world they lived in, principles were vital, but survival was the precondition for everything else. A dead healer heals no one. A silenced healer passes on nothing. The chain her mother had entrusted to her was more important than her pride. She agreed. The crisis came to a head 3 weeks later, on a market day in Chorazin. Ezra had gathered a small assembly of prominent men from several villages and invited them to hear his concerns about the healer of Kafar Nahum. It was not a formal trial. Ezra did not have the authority to convene one, but it had the feel of a trial, the weight and seriousness of a proceeding whose outcome could determine a person's fate. Miriam attended, accompanied by Nathan, by several patients who had traveled from neighboring villages to speak on her behalf, and by an elderly healer named Tobias from the town of Bethsaida, a man in his 70s who was widely respected throughout the region and who had known Miriam's mother, Hannah. Ezra presented his case with the careful, methodical rhetoric of a man trained in legal argumentation. He did not accuse Miriam directly of sorcery. He was too shrewd for that. Instead, he raised questions. He noted that Miriam used substances, myrrh, frankincense, exotic resins, that were also used in pagan religious rituals throughout the Roman world. He noted that she worked alone, without the supervision of any recognized male authority. He noted that she had accepted payment from Roman soldiers, an act that he characterized as morally suspect. And he suggested, without quite stating it, that the effectiveness of her remedies might derive from sources that were not entirely natural. It was a masterful performance, and Miriam could see its effect on the assembled men. Doubt was creeping into faces that had previously shown her nothing but trust. When it was her turn to speak, Miriam stood and addressed the assembly in a clear, steady voice. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead or weep. She spoke the way her mother had taught her to speak, with the quiet authority of someone who knew what she knew and was not ashamed of knowing it. She said that every remedy she used was derived from plants that grew in the soil of Israel and the surrounding lands. She said that myrrh and frankincense were used in the temple in Jerusalem, in the holy incense and the sacred anointing oil, and that calling them tools of pagan sorcery was an insult to the priests and to God. She said that her knowledge came from her mother, and her mother's knowledge had come from her mother, and that this chain of teaching stretched back further than any man in the room could trace his own lineage. She said that she worked alone because there was no one else in the village who had been trained in the healing arts, and that she would gladly accept the assistance and oversight of any qualified healer who wished to share the work and the responsibility. She said that she had treated the Roman soldiers because a healer heals, and that if any man in the room could show her a passage in the Torah that prohibited the easing of a sick man's suffering based on the flag he served under, she would read it and obey it. Then she invited the patients who had come with her to speak. One by one, they stood and told their stories. A mother from Magdala whose child had been burning with fever for 3 days until Miriam's hyssop infusion broke it. A fisherman from Bethsaida, whose infected hand Miriam had saved with a myrrh and honey poultice when the wound was so advanced that others had told him he would lose the hand. An old man from a village south of Tiberias, whose chronic digestive pain had been relieved by a treatment of cumin and coriander that Miriam had taught his wife to prepare so that they would not need to travel to see her again. And then Tobias spoke. The old healer stood slowly, leaning on a walking stick, and addressed the assembly with the gravity and authority of a man who had spent his entire life in service to his community. He said that he had known Miriam's mother, Hannah, and that Hannah had been one of the finest healers he had ever encountered. He said that the tradition Miriam practiced was the same tradition he himself had been taught, the same tradition that had been practiced in Israel for generations beyond count. He said that the plants Miriam used were God's own creations, placed in the earth for the benefit of his children, and that anyone who called their use sorcery was either ignorant or dishonest. The room was very quiet when Tobias finished. Ezra's face was tight and expressionless. The assembly shifted uncomfortably, and then, one by one, the men who had gathered to judge Miriam began to nod and mutter, and finally, reluctantly or openly, to express their support for the healer of Kfar Nahum. Ezra did not concede. He left the assembly without speaking further, his rigid back and clenched jaw conveying a fury that words would have diminished. But the crisis was over. Miriam had been vindicated, not by Roman authority or political maneuvering, but by the testimony of the people she had healed and the support of a fellow practitioner who understood the value of what she carried. That evening, walking back to Kfar Nahum along the dusty road that wound through the hills above the lake, Miriam and Nathan walked side by side in silence for a long time. The stars were coming out, thick and brilliant in the clear Galilean sky, and the air smelled of wild sage and cooling stone. Nathan said, "You were magnificent today." Miriam said, "I was frightened." Nathan said, "I know. That is what made it magnificent." They walked on, and somewhere in the darkness, a nightingale began to sing, its voice rising pure and defiant above the sleeping hills, a small, bright thread of beauty woven into the fabric of a harsh and uncertain world. The months that followed the assembly at Chorazin were the best of Miriam's life. The public vindication of her practice had strengthened her position in the community, and patients came to her in greater numbers than ever before. Nathan remained in Kfar Nahum, having quietly abandoned any pretense that his stay was temporary. He built a small extension onto Miriam's house, a workroom where he stored and sorted his trading goods, and the arrangement became a partnership in every sense, professional, domestic, and personal. They did not marry in a formal ceremony, as neither of them had family to arrange one, and the social conventions of their world made such arrangements complicated for people in their situation. But they lived together, worked together, and cared for each other with a steady, undemonstrative devotion that their neighbors quickly came to recognize and accept. Miriam used the balm of Gilead that Nathan had given her sparingly, reserving it for the most serious cases, the wounds that resisted her other remedies, the inflammations that did not respond to frankincense or myrrh alone. She discovered that the balm possessed properties she had not encountered in any other substance, a capacity to accelerate healing, reduce pain, and prevent the corruption of wounded tissue that surpassed even myrrh. When she combined the balm with her standard myrrh honey thyme poultice, the results were remarkable. Wounds that would normally have taken weeks to heal closed in days. Inflammations that had persisted for months resolved within a week. She documented each case in her memory, adding the balm of Gilead to the mental catalog of remedies that she carried with her at all times, another link in the chain of knowledge. She also began, for the first time, to teach, Her mother had trained her alone, one healer to one apprentice, in the traditional manner. But Miriam recognized that this model, while intimate and thorough, was also fragile. If she died without training a successor, everything she knew, everything her mother had known, everything the generations before them had accumulated, would be lost. One death, one accident, one illness, and the chain would break forever. There were no young women in Kfar Nahum who seemed suitable for the full apprenticeship that Miriam's training had entailed. But there were several women in the village and the surrounding communities who were interested in learning specific remedies, practical preparations they could use in their own homes to treat common ailments. Miriam began holding informal teaching sessions in her garden, showing small groups of women how to prepare basic herbal treatments: hyssop infusions for coughs, chamomile tea for sleeplessness, cumin preparations for digestive complaints, honey and olive oil dressings for minor wounds. She taught them which plants to gather, where to find them, when to harvest them, how to store them. She taught them the ratios and proportions that were critical for safety and effectiveness. And she taught them the most important principle of all, the one her mother had repeated 1,000 times. Observe. Pay attention. Watch how the patient responds. Watch how the illness changes. Do not assume that what worked for one person will work for another. Every body is different. Every illness has its own character. A good healer listens more than she speaks and observes more than she acts. These teaching sessions became a small but vital stream, feeding into the great river of traditional knowledge. The women who learned from Miriam carried the knowledge back to their own villages and families, passing it on to their daughters and neighbors, extending the reach of the healing tradition far beyond what any single healer could have achieved alone. Miriam did not know it, could not have known it, but the ripples from those afternoon sessions in her small garden would continue to spread for generations, forming part of the vast, invisible network of herbal knowledge that would sustain communities across the region for centuries to come. Nathan, meanwhile, continued his trading activities, traveling south for several weeks at a time to meet caravans and restock his supplies, then returning to Kfar Nahum with fresh myrrh, frankincense, and other medicinal substances that Miriam needed. He also brought news from the wider world, and much of that news was troubling. Tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman occupation were escalating. There had been incidents in Jerusalem, confrontations between crowds and soldiers, arrests, punishments. The name of a teacher from Nazareth, a man named Yeshua, was on everyone's lips, spoken with reverence by some and with fear by others. Nathan said that the roads were becoming more dangerous, that bandits were growing bolder, and that the Roman military presence was increasing in response to what the authorities perceived as growing unrest. Miriam listened to these reports with the quiet dread of someone who understood, from a lifetime of living under occupation, that when empires grew nervous, it was always the common people who suffered most. Her fears proved well-founded. In the 3rd year after Nathan's arrival in Kfar Nahum, a drought struck the region. The winter rains, which the entire agricultural economy of Galilee depended upon, failed almost completely. The fields did not produce their usual harvest. The cisterns were not replenished. Water became scarce, and with scarcity came rationing, conflict, and illness. The weakened, malnourished population was vulnerable to diseases that healthy, well-fed people could have resisted, and Miriam found herself overwhelmed with patients as an outbreak of a debilitating fever swept through the villages. She worked from dawn until well past dark, every day, for weeks on end. She prepared remedies in quantities she had never attempted before, boiling huge batches of hyssop and thyme infusions, grinding myrrh until her arms ached, mixing poultice after poultice for the feverish and the weak. Nathan helped her, his trader's practical competence proving invaluable as he organized supplies, managed the flow of patients, and ensured that Miriam herself ate and rested enough to continue functioning. The fever was merciless. Miriam saved many, but she also lost some, and each loss was a wound that did not heal with any poultice. An elderly man who had been her neighbor for 20 years, a young mother with 2 small children, a boy of 12 who reminded Miriam, with a pang that nearly broke her, of the younger brother she had lost in childhood to a similar illness. During the worst of the outbreak, Miriam developed a new preparation, a variation on her standard fever treatment that incorporated the balm of Gilead. She combined the balm with frankincense, hyssop, and honey, creating a thick aromatic paste that she dissolved in warm wine and administered to patients whose fevers had resisted her standard remedies. The results were striking. The new preparation seemed to reduce fever more rapidly and more consistently than anything else in her repertoire. Patients who received it showed improvement within hours rather than days. The recovery rate was noticeably higher. Miriam did not fully understand why the combination was so effective. She did not have the tools or the conceptual framework to identify the specific antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory compounds at work, compounds that modern science would later name and characterize, but she did not need to understand the mechanism to observe the result. She noted the preparation, its ingredients, its proportions, and its effects, and she committed them to memory with the same meticulous care that her mother had applied to every healing discovery. She also taught the preparation to several of the women who had been studying with her, ensuring that the knowledge would not be confined to a single mind. The drought eventually broke. The rains returned tentatively at first, then in generous soaking downpours that refilled the cisterns and turned the brown hillsides green again. The fever subsided as the population's strength recovered, and Miriam, exhausted but alive, stood in her garden one morning after the rains and looked at the herbs growing fresh and vigorous in the wet earth, and felt, for the first time in months, something like hope. She did not know that the years ahead would bring upheavals far greater than a drought. She did not know that the teacher from Nazareth would be arrested and executed in Jerusalem, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire world. She did not know that a generation later, Roman legions would march into Galilee and destroy the communities she had spent her life serving. She did not know that the knowledge she carried, the remedies she had refined and passed on, would survive these catastrophes and continue to be used in one form or another for 2,000 years. She knew only what she had always known, that the plants were patient, that the earth provided, that the chain of knowledge connecting healer to healer across the generations was the most fragile and the most precious thing in the world, and that her job, the job her mother had given her and her mother's mother had given her mother, was simply to keep it alive for one more day, one more patient, one more season. On a warm evening in late autumn, several years after the drought, Miriam sat in her garden with Nathan. They were both older now. Nathan's hair had gone fully gray at the temples. Miriam's hands, once smooth and quick, showed the wear of decades of grinding, mixing, and healing. But her eyes were still sharp, and her mind still held with perfect clarity every remedy, every preparation, every lesson her mother had ever taught her. A young woman named Adina had recently come to Miriam from a village near Bethsaida, asking to be taught the healing arts. Adina was 19, quiet, observant, with steady hands and a patience that Miriam recognized and valued. She had lost her own mother young and had been drawn to healing by the same instinct that had driven Miriam, the desire to fight against suffering, to stand between the people she loved, and the relentless, indiscriminate cruelty of disease. Miriam had accepted Adina as her apprentice, the first full apprentice she had ever taken, and the training had begun in earnest. Every morning, they went into the hills together to gather herbs, and Miriam taught Adina what Hannah had taught her, the names of the plants, their properties, their seasons, their secrets. Every afternoon, they worked in the garden and the workshop, preparing remedies, treating patients, discussing cases. Every evening, Miriam told Adina stories about Hannah, about patients she had treated, about the principles and observations that formed the invisible scaffolding of the healing tradition. On this particular evening, Adina had gone to bed early, tired from a long day of learning, and Miriam and Nathan were alone in the garden. The lake was calm and dark below the village, reflecting the stars. The air smelled of the last of the season's herbs, rosemary and thyme, and the faint lingering sweetness of dried chamomile flowers. Nathan looked at Miriam and said, "Do you ever think about what will happen to all of this?" He gestured at the garden, the house, the shelves of jars visible through the open door. After us, after Adina, 100 years from now, 1,000. Miriam was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think about it every day. I think about whether the chain will hold or whether it will break. Whether someone someday will look at a jar of myrrh and not know what it is for. Whether the names of the plants will be forgotten. Whether the knowledge that my mother gave me, that I am giving to Adina, will simply vanish, like water poured into sand." She paused. And then she said something that Nathan would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "But I also think that the knowledge is not really ours. We hold it for a time, the way a river holds water. The water passes through, and the river remains. Someday, the form may change. The words may change. The people may change. But the knowledge itself, the truth that the earth provides what we need to heal, that will not change. Because it is not a human invention. It is a fact of the world. And facts do not disappear just because the people who know them do. They wait. They wait in the soil, in the seeds, in the roots of the plants. And someday, someone will find them again. Someone will crush a leaf and smell it and think, this can help. and the chain will start again. Nathan reached over and took her hand. They sat together in the darkness, two ordinary people in an extraordinary time, holding between them a thread of knowledge that was older than memory and more resilient than empires. Miriam of Kfar Nahum died on a spring morning 12 years later, peacefully, in the house where she had spent most of her life. Adina was at her side. By then, Adina was a skilled and confident healer in her own right, with patients of her own and a growing reputation in the region. She had learned everything Miriam could teach her, and she had added her own observations and discoveries to the tradition, as every healer in the chain had done before her. Nathan had died 2 years before Miriam, quietly, in his sleep, after a brief illness. Miriam had treated him with every remedy she knew, and when the remedies were not enough, she had sat beside him and held his hand and told him stories about the plants, about the hills, about the long and beautiful and improbable life they had built together in a small stone house on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. After Miriam's death, Adina took over the house and the workshop. She continued the teaching sessions that Miriam had started, training other women in the basics of herbal medicine. She accepted her own apprentice, a girl named Ruth, and began the long, patient process of transmission once again. And Ruth, in time, would teach another, and that one would teach another, and the chain would extend onward into the future, stretching through centuries of upheaval and transformation, through the destruction of the temple, through the scattering of communities, through the rise and fall of empires, through plagues and wars and dark ages and renaissances, always adapting, always surviving, always carrying the fundamental truth that Miriam and Hannah and all the healers before them had known, that the earth provides, and that the knowledge of its gifts is the most sacred inheritance one generation can give to the next. 2,000 years later, the plants that Miriam used still grow wild in the hills of Galilee. Hyssop clings to the rocky slopes above the ruins of Capernaum. Wild thyme carpets the meadows where shepherds once grazed their flocks. Frankincense trees still bleed their golden tears in the deserts of Arabia. Myrrh resin still darkens in the sun along the ancient incense routes. And somewhere, in a laboratory or a kitchen or a garden, someone is crushing a leaf, smelling it, and thinking, this can help. The chain has not broken. Battered by time, frayed by forgetting, stretched thin across millennia and continents, it holds. It holds because the knowledge is not merely human. It is older than humanity. It is written in the chemistry of the plants themselves, in the compounds they produce, in the interactions between their molecules and our bodies, in the ancient, wordless dialogue between the living earth and the living creatures who walk upon it. 30 AD. No antibiotics, no operating rooms, no pharmaceutical corporations. Just a woman in a stone house, a mortar and pestle, a shelf of clay jars, and the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations of healers who watched and listened and learned and remembered and passed it on. Miriam would not have called herself a scientist. She would not have understood the word, but she was one. She was one of the greatest scientists of her age, and her laboratory was a garden, and her journal was her memory, and her legacy was every life she saved, and every student she taught, and every remedy she perfected, and every link she forged in the long, unbroken chain that connects the healing wisdom of the ancient world to the rediscoveries of the modern one. And if we are wise, if we are paying attention, if we are willing to listen to the earth the way Miriam listened, the way Hannah listened, the way Adina and Ruth and all the unnamed healers of the centuries listened, then the chain will not break. Not today, not in 1,000 years, not ever. Because the earth remembers, the plants remember, and all they ask of us is that we remember too. If you watched all the way to this moment, it is because this story lives inside you now. Leave a comment saying, I watched until the end, so I can know you, so I can see your face among the thousands who pass through this channel, so I can know who truly values these stories. If you are not yet subscribed, subscribe right now, because stories like this one are rare, and the only way to make sure they find you is to be part of this community. Hit the like button, because every like is a vote that says this knowledge matters, that these voices from 2,000 years ago deserve to be heard today. And share this video with someone you love, someone who believes that the old wisdom still has power, someone who needs to be reminded that the earth has not forgotten us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Until the next story, take care of each other, and take care of the world that has always taken care of us.